Very nice to be with you all, and thanks for hopping on. Thank you, Mark, for hosting and timing the sit, and thank you, Joan, for those announcements. I think I want to just start with a very short point about the upcoming retreats, the fourth in that sequence. Again, it's not necessary to have done prior ones. Each retreat is its own experience. We're looking at sort of zones of growth in wisdom and compassion and clarity through meditation practice. And each retreat has a somewhat different area of focus. But each of those areas is, I would say, deeply helpful for all of us in our lives. And just a little point about this practice we do together in its various components, including retreats. Teachers, the practices, the practice, the community, the retreats, together provide a context of safety and encouragement. They make it safe to grow and encourage us to seek to grow. That's the point. I think if we understand that, we get that this kind of practice and training is us as students. It's our own work, it's our own effort, it's our own commitment, it's our own investment of time and energy. It's our own diligence in practice that sort of drives it. But the context is actually rather important because it pulls us, it gently pulls us out of ourselves. It's like, the seed, a seed has kind of got all it needs, in a sense, contained within it. But actually, it only has all it needs contained within it when it's in the right context. The context of the soil and the moisture and the warmth and the sun and so on. That context pulls it, encourages it to become what it can become. And I think practice is rather similar. And, all of us who are put into this role, however reluctantly or not, of guiding others, we've been through that. We've seen and experienced what it's like to have that context. And it's really important because every bit of growth that we do is always into what we don't yet know. It's always growth in this kind of business, meditation business. It means growing out of what we know. It's always like a little heartbeat lost into something we don't know. And so having the context that is saying and has been saying for thousands of years, yes, this can happen. Yes, you can do this, is is an incredible thing, actually. I don't say that meaning, Henry and Valerie are sort of offering something incredible. No, we're part of, we ourselves are in a context. We ourselves are in this process. And, we may be sort of stand-ins among all the many other pieces, primary among which is actually each of us sitting here. We are not only in this context, we are actually making the context. We are part of the context for others. Just as we receive the blessing of this benevolent context, we are actually also creating it for others together, if you see what I mean. So these retreats are a critical part of that. Yeah, I mean, critical in the sense that they allow for going that much deeper when we're all together, engaged in the same, trusting in the same unknown possibilities. And that context making it okay to let go of the parameters and the bearings that we have been living by, the deep assumptions we make and don't often get a chance to, well, deeply examine. Okay, now, having said all that, I want to just remind ourselves of sort of why we might do this. And of course, the basic answer is always the same. It's because of suffering. Why do we suffer? Why is there so much suffering? And it's not, of course, there are sort of many different ways that people have attempted to answer that. And, you could say, I suppose, religions attempt to respond to that. And they tend to have some kind of notion of, the solution is some way or another getting closer to or more aligned with a kind of supreme being. If we're more in alignment with that, we'll suffer less. If we're closer to that, we'll suffer less. And, of course, that can vary from highly doctrinal and dogmatic to vastly mystical and experiential, moving into sort of, the G word as a cipher for the mystery of being. And when it's that end of religious practice and experience, obviously it's getting closer to the sort of Zen kind of way, Zen Buddhist way. And then there are, I think what we're seeing in modern Western Buddhism emerging is a really beautiful coming together of evolutionary science, of neuroscience, and of Buddhist practice. Buddhism, I mentioned there Buddhism partly because we're, I suppose, we're Buddhists in a sense in Zen. I mean, clearly we are. Whether or not you've formally become a Buddhist, this is a Buddhist method that we've received. So yeah, but Buddhism, I think it's fair to say, I hope this is fair to say, has the most sophisticated and clearly articulated meditation methodology that's least religious, that's most humanist. Of course, this varies from school to school of Buddhism, but I think in the modern forms of Buddhism in the West have been picking up on early sutras that lay out plans of meditation very minutely, and in a way that's very, very compatible with modern psychology. But so we might ask that question again: why do we suffer? And I want to just paraphrase one of my mentors, actually, Shinzen Young. I happened to stumble into a session recently when he was doing it was quite by chance, actually. I just got a thing on my phone and hit it rather than deleted it. Usually I just sort of delete things that come in on the phone unless known friends and colleagues and so on, and collaborative whatever. But I just on an impulse joined this thing, and then boom, landed in this what he calls an AMA, ask me anything. And he was talking about suffering, and he just laid it out extremely clearly. And I'm going to attempt to basically parrot what he said, which is, we he said that he saw human suffering, as an evolutionary glitch. That evolution doesn't always sort of do things right. When we got bipedal, there are costs, of course. Lower back issues are quite common, and so on, and birthing problems came out of bipedalism, and also combined with our cranial capacity growing, and evolution wanted that, but it's a challenge for the birthing process for humans. For example, but at the same time, this happened with the way our brains function. We got highly complex nervous systems. I think we all know that. I think I can't remember the numbers now off the top of my head, but really significantly, we got a ton of neurons, and a ton of subsystems that the neurons are dealing with, and so there's a lot of collaboration with all these different elements of our neurology that have to try to work together and clash and compete for, what do you call it, airtime, and we're also so it's complex. We've got our reptilian brain, then we've got our mammalian brain, and then we've got the lavish prefrontal cortex, compared with other beautiful beasts. And so it's a complex thing to coordinate. There's that. Also, we are, what's the word? We're built to emphasize the negative. We're built in part to, evolutionarily speaking, we've developed with these prime urges, to eat, to reproduce, but those really pale in comparison in importance to the necessity of not being eaten. If we get eaten, those are irrelevant. So the primary thing, is to stay alive. So, we have sort of 19 times as much neurology receptive to negative, sort of thing, if you see what I mean. So we're and of course we're thin-skinned. This is, I've got to say, I'm not doing a very good job of parroting Shinzen Young. I'm throwing in a few other points as well, and probably not very well speaking about his. So that's, but that's a little overview of why we suffer. And then what do we do about it? Well, like I was saying, we might do the religious thing, we might do the more common thing, which is simply to try to get as much of the good stuff and avoid as much of the bad stuff as possible, which would be a sort of, perhaps it's fair to say, unexamined way of working with it. Or we find ourselves in a situation like this context I was talking about, namely practice context, where we have discovered ways exist and have been cultivated and developed and passed on of actually changing our relationship with our neurology, changing how we respond to stimuli in life and how we can actually, in a sense, defuse some of these urges and be freer of them. So here we could say there's a little bit of a sort of two-pronged approach. One being, in Buddhist terminology, recognizing the three poisons. Desire, greed, craving, grasping, flavors of wanting is the first. The second is aversion. Could be hatred, ill will, aggression, just pulling away from, pushing back against, and the third being misunderstanding, delusion, ignorance, at different sort of levels. Could simply be not understanding the engines of suffering, or more, profoundly, it could be mistaking processes in the body and mind for the existence of a separate self. Taking those processes to be evidence of a separate self. So now this sort of two-pronged approach, so to speak, I'm not sure I'm putting that quite right, but you'll see what I'm getting at. One way is managing these impulses and so on, trying to get a handle on them and reduce their potential for harm and suffering. And that's great and, wonderful if we get to that. That's good. We can basically disempower them. Another way, and this may not be clear right away how this is different. By the way, I'm sorry, this is no longer Shinzen. This is Henry. Another way, well, it's whatever it is. This other way is not so much disempowering those things, but becoming disentranced by them. In other words, you might say, seeing through them. So one approach is sort of management. The other approach is what we call awakening, where we see through. In other words, we can work with, say, anxiety in the body, and we should, it's great. And there are strategies for becoming able to love our experience of anxiety. I mean, it's a practice, it's not always easy, but we can, and we can be less troubled by it. We can also, in our deep mammalian way, we experience heartbreak. It's not likely, really, that we'll go through life without heartbreak, and it's probably not necessarily a good thing if we do, because our hearts are built that way. They're tender. It's a beautiful thing that we have this capacity to love so much that it hurts us when others that we love are in pain. However, this seeing through is to discover that whatever kind of emotional distress we may be experiencing, and I'm talking on, I guess sort of, you could say, sort of deeper level, that it actually is a sort of priceless treasure, because it's absolutely one with the boundless reality of all. So this is a different kind of approach to distress, where instead of trying to manage it, we actually may suddenly discover that, for example, our heartbreak is a manifestation of the same boundlessness that once we taste it, it encompasses everything. I don't really know if I'm expressing this very clearly. I'm sorry, I'm doing my best right now, just given circumstances, which is my old noggin is still a little bit under the weather. And I don't really, I just hope that this is making some kind of sense. Just at least as a sort of conceptual map kind of thing. Now, yeah. So one thing that would happen if we see that is that we don't have so much need to push away are difficult feelings, right? They're 100% um, acceptable. They're welcome. Why wouldn't they be? You know, they are. It's like the Blake poem where he says, William Blake, you know, he says, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. What is it? Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. If you want to see a world in a grain of sand, if you want to be able, this is just like Zen. There's a master, Seppo, who said, when you pick up the whole world in your fingers, it's the size of a grain of rice. When you pick up the whole world in your fingers, it's the size of a grain of rice. This is just like how to see a world in a grain of sand. Well, the only way, I mean, he lays it out, Blake. He says, if you want to do that, you have to be able to see infinity in the palm of your hand. This too is extraordinarily Zen-like. Our most famous koan, the sound of one hand. What is the sound of one hand? Is precisely, can you see infinity in the palm of your hand? If you can, you'll see a world in a grain of sand. You'll also see the world in your own heartache. You'll see the universe in your distress. And it brings us all together. That level of discovery of our humanness does it doesn't, it's like it's deeply us, and it doesn't belong to anyone. We're all there. It can't be owned by anyone. It's where we sort of slip away from our moorings of being who we think we are. And we discover this communion, this, but that's not quite the right word, because it's not limited, it's boundless, but we're all there. We're all there. And because of that, we're stirred by the suffering of others. That reminds me of a beautiful point that Shinzen made the other night. He said, he was sort of talking about compassion. I can't remember exactly how, it must have been another question. And he said, compassion is, it's kind of reverse James Bond. So what's he talking about? Well, basically, what he meant was, you know, how James Bond liked his martinis, shaken, not stirred. Shinzo said, no, well, we've got to be stirred but not shaken. That's compassion. I thought it's a very good way to put it. And you don't, by the way, you don't have to have this sort of blazing discovery of universal oneness in order to have compassion. It's just that this boundless, all-holding awareness is intrinsically, wildly compassionate. This is why, there are all these reminders in the traditional literature not to get stuck in blissed out places, because we can get, I mean, it's great that we find deep inner peace and bliss. There's nothing, of course, intrinsically wrong with that. It's only if we sort of get stuck there. It's the problem is that we haven't yet. There's always more. There's always more unfolding, and where that unfolding takes us will be to this, this basically sort of boundless, compassionate energy of compassion that wants to help, that sees suffering and is stirred, not shaken, to action. If you're shaken, you might sort of fall apart, whatever. Okay, so I think that's basically the main points that I wanted to touch on this evening. Yes, this upcoming retreat, we will be looking a little more directly at the experience, I would say experiences of awakenings, different faces of awakening that we may taste, all having certain things in common, somehow released from the contraction, holding that makes us believe in me, somehow released from that. But there are different faces, and they're all beautiful. And yeah, okay. So let's hold steady in our practice, and let's trust that actually we are part of a greater unfolding. We really are. We are gloves on the hands of the body of a greater universal unfolding that's going on. And maybe having a bit of that perspective can help us in uncertain, turbulent, strange times, as a much bigger processes are going on. So from that perspective, we don't have to worry quite so much. Okay, thank you very much.